Today we're going to be talking about a subject I don't see a lot of other videos cover: colour grading. Colour grading is the process of changing the tonal balance of the colour spectrum in order to evoke a style or preferred look. It's often a key factor in a director's toolkit, such as Zack Snyder's washed out colour palettes or the teal and orange visuals in George Miller's Mad Max franchise. Colour grading is usually done towards the end of post-production, like a final coat of paint over the shots in an edit, in order to complete the tone that a director is going for in a film. This brings us to what we're going to be discussing due to its experimental colour grading, House MD. House MD is a medical drama, which is a genre that's pretty well-worn territory by now if you've watched a lot of TV. Most of them tend to look the same and don't go out of their way to try experimental visuals. It would be unfair to expect this from some because the focus is usually on story and just making many episodes quickly and efficiently. House shares a lot of similarities with some of these other shows, such as the focus on story and shot compositions which prioritise telling these stories as easily as possible. As you can see by some examples I've shown here, other medical shows also tend to have a uniform colour grade to them. I think we all kind of know how hospitals and medical dramas tend to look, which is mostly warm tones to make these environments feel more inviting, because you're going to be spending a lot of time in them. The reason I'm looking at the pilot for House specifically is because of its unique look. The pilot episode uses some strong orange tones, which is unique for its genre and also unique for the show itself. Before I focus on the House pilot, I'd like to just take a quick look at other points in the show which I think will give context to how extreme the pilot is in contrast. Series 1 tends to push a yellow hue onto most scenes, which gives the show a sort of sickly looking vibe. I can see why this was changed, as after long periods it is sort of an eyesore. Series 2 has a pinkish hue to most scenes that make it seem like it's taking place during the evening. This is especially noticeable on skin tones. I don't know why it was done like this, as it doesn't really help convey anything specific about the episode it features in, but it is certainly unique. Series 3 mostly sticks with naturalistic lighting, which I think is emblematic of the creators finally deciding on a look for the show. This could also be a time-saving measure, as there's a lot of episodes per year to get through. This is personally my sweet spot for how the show looked. Then, in the last season, they seem to go to this incredibly washed out look, which I think is meant to be a reflection of the generally darker narrative tone in the final season, but it also makes the show look incredibly flat and ugly looking. Jumping back to the pilot, the last thing I describe it as is flat. Skin tones are universally bright orange and there are deep harsh shadows in most shots of the episode. I'd like to discuss why I think this was done and why I think it really works in a pilot episode. I won't be talking about the narrative in the pilot episode of House, but an element established in the story that I think is important is House's addiction to the painkiller Vicodin. I've watched the series through multiple times and I've often wondered if this artistic choice was something that would have been present in the other episodes in the series, but was seen as too extreme for a television series in the mid-2000s. I think that this colour palette could also have been chosen in order to convey House's drug-addled perspective. As you can see, every other colour besides orange has been desaturated and the light sources are harsh and almost blinding. The show is going to be filtered mostly through House's thoughts and opinions on whatever theme an episode will cover, so it's vital we know how he sees the world. I'd like to talk about some specific moments where I feel that the colour grade is really effective in highlighting the emotions of a scene and letting us relate to the characters. Firstly, the scene where we're introduced to Cameron, Chase and Foreman, House's team. This is where House's morals and the big recurring themes of the show are laid out clearly for the audience. We've seen House take his pain relief many times at this point, so we can see that the bottle his Vicodin comes in is orange. I think that this is a big hint towards how his Vicodin abuse ultimately colours his worldview and affects his interactions with everyone. You can see through most of the scene he's not even looking at the team, and just looking at the information that's on his board. The desaturated visuals, I think, are meant to highlight his disinterest in anything but the discussion of the medicine. An element that's often brought up later is that House's other addiction is solving these medical mysteries. Again, I don't think that these ideas were being introduced in some incredibly foreshadowed way, but it makes a rewatch interesting because I know that this theme will be important later. Secondly, the scene where the patient undergoes an MRI is coated in a dark yellow that gives off this incredibly ominous vibe, which when working in tandem with the shot composition, which is tight on the face, and the editing, which is kinetic and unstable, it creates a very unsettling effect that showcases how the patient is feeling during the procedure. This, in conjunction with the green lighting inside the small office, creates a great looking moment as well as an extra layer in reflecting the patient's feelings. I think the world being very desaturated could also highlight House's thinking process. If we look at the scene in the clinic where House is interacting with a patient whose skin has turned orange, it shows us that he's hyperfixating on a symptom that is key to figuring out what's wrong with him. This works really well in tandem with House's amused demeanour, where it seems like he isn't listening, but he'd already picked up on the important detail before the conversation had even started, highlighting his intelligence. The next scene I want to highlight is when Wilson goes to examine the patient. The shots now have more of a blue filter on them, which I think works well to highlight that the patient is going to end this scene by deteriorating and losing their eyesight. The last scene I want to talk about is when House finally goes to see the person he's been treating the whole time. The shots are incredibly dark and washed out, which reflects how the patient must be feeling, as she's given up and now wants to be discharged home so she can die. The dramatic colour grade is because this is House's final chance to convince her that what he's doing will work. She just needs to trust him and accept his belief that she's being irrational. He does ultimately fail in this scene, but it's important to show that deep down beneath the sarcasm and the pills, House is a caring person. It's also a breakdown of House as a character, as she dresses him down ultimately, and suggests that his earlier speech about not seeing patients because they lie is a lie itself, and that he avoids human contact because he doesn't like the way he's treated by them and the wider world. What seems to convince her in the end is his simple belief that
there's no such thing. Our bodies break down, sometimes when we're 90, sometimes before we're even born, but it always happens and there's never any dignity in it. I don't care if you can walk, see, wipe your own ass. It's always ugly, always. You can live with dignity, you can't die with it.
Ultimately, she decides against the treatment and the colour palette has jumped back to what it was earlier, suggesting that House is slightly put out by his attempt to emotionally connect with someone, and he's regressed to his earlier emotional state. This is another theme of the show being highlighted, which is House's attempts to better himself and find some sort of connection that will change his worldview and ultimately make him a happier person. Back to the colour palette though, I think that transitioning back to the earlier visual style works well with his dejected demeanour.
I solved the case. My work is done.
The colour palette does stay the same after this, so whatever effect I've claimed is entirely up to you, I suppose. The episode continues towards the ending without anything major to talk about, besides this creative use of lighting to highlight a patient that House had treated earlier in the clinic. This man was someone who was trying to tell House what he thought he had, and House had given him some mints from a vending machine as a placebo medicine to show that the patient was a hypochondriac. This shot and House's amused reaction to it show that House was ultimately in the right, and it draws a sort of parallel between this and the main story. In conclusion, I felt that this different approach at colour grading really gives the pilot episode of House a unique energy and feeling. I'm fully willing to admit that when talking about how it's a showcase of House's perspective that I could be overthinking it, but it does give the story a different element to consider. It's a useful way of informing the audience that this character's perspective is the one you'll be following, and that ultimately his is the most important voice. I think ultimately it works really well at giving the audience more of an insight into House's process and how his worldview has been warped by his drug abuse. Even if it does give him the insight to help people, questions are already being raised about its effectiveness and whether or not it's entirely ethical. No pun intended, but it really does colour your expectations in a really interesting way, and I would have liked to see future episodes do something similar, or do something extreme in a totally different direction. There is a counter argument here to what I think though. There are plenty of times in the episode where House isn't all present and the shots still look like this, like in the opening scene or in the scene where House's subordinates interact with the patient. Ultimately, I think that this kind of experimental colour grading creates a more interesting conversation about what kind of meanings you can create with it, and I take something like this than the flat, usual grades that later House episodes and other network television would use. I hope you enjoyed the video. This was a really fun, niche topic to cover, and I'd love to cover House again in a different topic. See you next time.